While we're on the subject of absurd people, Meghan Markle's back in the news.
For years, royal watchers have debated interviews, photographs, and public appearances connected to Meghan Markle. But recently, attention shifted to something far more unexpected. Not a new interview, not a new social media post, not even a fresh royal controversy. Instead, the discussion began with a decades-old magazine. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a forgotten page buried in an archive. The kind of publication thousands of people would have flipped through without giving it a second thought. Yet when online users began taking a closer look, they noticed a detail that immediately sparked debate. Within days, screenshots were spreading across social media, commentators were weighing in, and a question that few people had ever considered suddenly became the center of an entirely new conversation. What exactly did people find? And why are royal commentators still talking about it today? Because according to many observers, the real story may not be the magazine itself. The real story is how one small detail managed to create such a large reaction years later. The publication at the center of the discussion was a magazine feature dating back to the late 1990s. Like many entertainment and youth magazines of that era, it included short profiles highlighting young people pursuing opportunities in television, film, and the wider entertainment industry. At the time, there was nothing particularly remarkable about it. The feature appeared, readers moved on, and for years it remained buried in archives, largely forgotten by the public. Then everything changed. Decades later, online users revisiting old publications stumbled across the magazine once again. What they found immediately caught attention. Not because of a dramatic headline or a shocking revelation, but because of a small detail that some people believed didn't seem to fit with publicly known information. That single observation was enough to start a conversation. At first, only a handful of users discussed it. Then screenshot began circulating. Soon, the magazine page was appearing across social media platforms, discussion forums, and YouTube channels dedicated to royal commentary. As often happens with stories involving high-profile public figures, the conversation quickly split into two camps. Some people dismissed the entire matter almost immediately. In their view, old magazines contain mistakes all the time. Printing errors happen. Editors miss details. Information gets entered incorrectly. To them, there was nothing especially unusual about a decades-old publication containing an inaccurate piece of information. Others weren't so sure. They argued that while mistakes certainly occur, magazines typically pass through multiple stages of editing and review before reaching print. That raised a different question. If the information was incorrect, how did it make its way into the final publication in the first place? The debate wasn't really about the magazine anymore. It was becoming a discussion about how information is recorded, how mistakes happen, and why certain stories continue attracting attention years after they first appeared. As more people discovered the article, the conversation expanded. Social media users began comparing dates, reviewing archive material, and searching for other publicly available records. Before long, royal commentators were discussing the issue as well. Some viewed the entire story as little more than an interesting publishing error that had taken on a life of its own. Others argued that the public fascination surrounding Meghan Markle meant that even the smallest detail would inevitably attract scrutiny. And perhaps that is what made the story so unusual. What began as a single line in an old magazine had evolved into a much larger discussion involving media accuracy, public records, online investigations, and the enduring public interest surrounding one of the most talked-about figures connected to the modern royal story. Yet as commentators continued examining the magazine feature, another question started emerging. Because for some observers, the most interesting part wasn't the discrepancy itself. It was what happened when people began comparing that magazine entry with other publicly known information. Section 2. As the discussion continued, many observers began asking a different question. If the magazine entry was simply a mistake, why had it generated such a strong reaction in the first place? The answer, according to several commentators, had very little to do with the publication itself. Instead, it had everything to do with Meghan Markle's position in the public eye. For most public figures, an error buried inside a decades-old magazine would likely go unnoticed. Even if someone discovered it, the story might generate a brief discussion before disappearing again. But Meghan Markle is not most public figures. Years after stepping into the global spotlight, she remains one of the most discussed personalities connected to the modern royal story. Every interview, every appearance, every public statement, and every resurfaced document tends to attract attention far beyond what many other public figures experience. That reality helps explain why the magazine feature became such a talking point. Soon, online users began doing what internet communities often do. They started comparing information from different sources. Old articles were revisited, archived interviews resurfaced, biographical profiles were examined, publicly available records were discussed. And before long, the conversation had expanded far beyond the original magazine page. For some observers, the most interesting aspect of the story was no longer the discrepancy itself. It was a public reaction. Why were people spending so much time analyzing a publication that had been forgotten for decades? According to commentators, the answer may lie in the unique relationship between modern public figures and the internet. In previous generations, a magazine era might have remained buried forever. Today, however, digital archives allow old publications to be rediscovered with a single search. A story that seemed finished decades ago can suddenly return to public attention overnight. And when that story involves someone as recognizable as Meghan Markle, the reaction can become even larger. Royal commentators began noting that this pattern has appeared repeatedly over the years. An old interview resurfaces. A forgotten photograph reappears online. A decades-old article attracts new attention. And each time, a fresh debate emerges. Some people see these discoveries as important pieces of a larger puzzle. Others see them as little more than historical curiosities that are being overanalyzed. That difference in perspective became one of the most fascinating parts of the entire discussion. Because while people disagreed about the significance of the magazine entry, many agreed on one thing. The story had become much bigger than a simple publishing error. It had evolved into a debate about public narratives, media records, and the way information is interpreted years after it first appears. Yet as commentators continued discussing the issue, another development began attracting attention. Because some observers noticed that the magazine wasn't the only old piece of information being revisited. Other archive material was starting to resurface as well. And according to several commentators, that was where the conversation took an even more unexpected turn. Section 3. As more archive material began resurfacing, the conversation started moving in a direction few people had anticipated. What began as a discussion about a single magazine entry was gradually becoming a wider debate about public records, media profiles, and the way personal histories are documented over time. And according to several commentators, that shift was significant, because once people start revisiting old publications, they rarely stop with just one. Soon, online users were comparing magazine features, interview transcripts, entertainment profiles, and archived articles from different periods of Meghan Markle's life. For some observers, this was simply curiosity. For others, it was an attempt to understand how public narratives evolve over time. Royal commentators noted that this phenomenon isn't unique to Meghan Markle. Public figures across politics, entertainment, and royalty often find old interviews and forgotten articles returning to the spotlight years later. Statements that seemed ordinary at the time can suddenly attract attention when viewed through a modern lens. And that is exactly what some people believed was happening here. The discussion was no longer focused on whether the magazine contained an error. Instead, people were asking a broader question. How much can a single archive publication actually tell us? Some commentators argue that old articles provide only a snapshot of a particular moment in time. They pointed out that people change, careers evolve, and circumstances shift. Looking at one isolated publication, they argued, rarely provides a full picture. Others disagreed. They believe that historical records, even imperfect ones, remain valuable because they capture information before later events influence public perception. That disagreement became another major source of debate. Because depending on which perspective someone adopted, the same magazine page could appear either completely insignificant or unexpectedly important. As the discussion intensified, social media users began sharing additional examples of old stories suddenly returning to public attention. Forgotten interviews resurfaced. Archived photographs circulated again. Decades-old articles were being discussed by audiences that had never seen them when they were originally published. The magazine feature was now part of a much larger trend. And according to some commentators, that trend says something important about modern celebrity culture. In the digital age, nothing truly disappears. An article published decades ago can be rediscovered in minutes. A forgotten interview can suddenly become relevant again. A single screenshot can generate thousands of reactions across multiple platforms. That reality helps explain why stories like this continue attracting attention long after they were supposedly finished. Yet even as commentators debated the broader implications, another question continued hanging over the discussion. Why had this particular magazine entry generated such a strong reaction compared with countless other publishing mistakes that occur every year? Some believe the answer was simple. The story involved Meghan Markle. And because Meghan remains one of the most talked about figures connected to the royal family, even relatively small discoveries can quickly become major talking points. But according to others, there may have been another reason. Because the debate was no longer being driven by the magazine itself. It was being driven by what people believed the magazine represented. And that distinction would soon become the most controversial part of the entire story. Section 4. By this point, the discussion had moved far beyond the original magazine entry. The debate was no longer centered on whether a publishing mistake had occurred. Instead, it had become a discussion about something much larger. Public trust. Because according to several commentators, the real reason stories like this continue attracting attention is that they tap into a question audiences constantly ask about public figures. What information should people trust? In an age where countless articles, interviews, profiles, documentaries, podcasts, and social media posts exist, the public is often left trying to determine which sources deserve the most credibility. And that is where the magazine story took on a life of its own. For some observers, the publication represented nothing more than an isolated error that had been blown far out of proportion. For others, it became an example of how even small discrepancies can trigger larger conversations. The disagreement was no longer about a number on a page. It was about interpretation. Royal commentators began pointing out that modern audiences rarely consume information in isolation. Instead, people compare. They compare interviews. They compare articles. They compare timelines. They compare public statements made years apart. And when those comparisons reveal even the slightest inconsistency, discussions can quickly grow far beyond the original source. That pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout modern royal coverage. A photograph becomes a headline. An interview answer becomes a debate. A social media post becomes a news story. A forgotten article suddenly attracts global attention. The magazine feature seemed to follow that exact pattern. And according to some commentators, that may explain why the story continued spreading long after many expected it to disappear. The internet rewards mysteries. It rewards unanswered questions. It rewards discussions where different people reach different conclusions. And this story contained all three. Some commentators argued there was never any real mystery at all. To them, the explanation was straightforward. Publishing mistakes happen. Editors make errors. Facts occasionally get printed incorrectly. Case closed. But others argue that the public reaction itself was worth examining. Not because the magazine necessarily proved anything, but because it revealed how audiences engage with information in the digital age. One old publication, one small detail, and suddenly thousands of people were discussing archives, records, timelines, and media accuracy. That transformation fascinated many observers far more than the original discrepancy ever could. Yet just when the discussion seemed to be settling into two familiar sides, another development emerged, because commentators began noticing that the debate itself was becoming part of a larger conversation. A conversation about why certain royal stories continue capturing public attention year after year. And according to some observers, that question may ultimately be more interesting than the magazine story that started it all. Section 5 plus outro. As the debate continued, many commentators arrived at a conclusion that surprised some observers. The most interesting part of the story was no longer the magazine. It was a reaction. After all, countless publishing mistakes occur every year. Most are forgotten almost immediately. They generate little discussion and attract almost no lasting attention. Yet this particular story followed a very different path. A single detail buried inside a decades-old publication managed to spark conversations across social media, news platforms, discussion forums, and royal commentary channels. Why? According to many observers, the answer lies in a unique position Meghan Markle occupies within the public conversation. Years after becoming one of the most recognizable figures associated with a modern royal story, she continues to generate extraordinary levels of interest. Supporters and critics alike often examine interviews, appearances, articles, and public statements in ways that few public figures experience. And because of that, even relatively small discoveries can quickly become major topics of discussion. Some commentators believe the magazine's story ultimately demonstrates the dangers of reading too much into isolated pieces of information. They argue that one publication, viewed on its own, rarely provides enough context to support broad conclusions. Others take a different view. They believe that revisiting historical records can be valuable because it helps people understand how public narratives are formed, challenged, and sometimes rewritten over time. The debate between those two perspectives is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. And perhaps that is the real reason this story attracted so much attention. Not because everyone agreed, but because nobody agreed. The magazine became a symbol for a much larger discussion about media accuracy, public records, internet investigations, and the public fascination that continues to surround members of the royal story. In many ways, the disagreement itself became the headline. One side saw a simple publishing mistake. Another saw an interesting mystery. Others view the entire episode as an example of how modern audiences interact with information in the digital age. And that may be the most revealing part of all. Because decades after the magazine was first printed, people are still talking about it, still debating it, still interpreting it in different ways. And that raises one final question. Was this simply an ordinary error that unexpectedly captured public attention? Or does a continued discussion reveal something larger about the way royal stories evolve long after the original events are past? As always, the answer depends on who you ask. But one thing is certain. A forgotten magazine entry that sat unnoticed for years has now become part of a much wider conversation, one that continues to generate debate, attract commentary, and remind us how quickly old stories can return to the spotlight. What do you think? Was this nothing more than a publishing mistake? Or do you understand why the story generated so much attention? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more royal stories, forgotten moments, and fascinating debates from the world of royalty. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.